Hands of the week. Oh, my pinky touched yours very delicately.
It was nice.
All right, let's talk about a hand. Maybe the second best player on Hustler
Nick
played.
Airball?
So we are playing 25, 50, 100, 200, 400.
As you do.
We go ahead and open from the hijack to 1,000 with ace-4 of diamonds. There are multiple aggressive regs in the blinds here, including Rampage, Suited Superman, and Airball. And I think just when there are aggressive regs who are going to be 3-betting more, who aren't going to be calling quite as wide, just going with the smaller size is kind of nice.
Yeah, you lose a little bit less when you're forced to raise fold.
It folds all the way around to Suited, who is in the first straddle, and he calls, and Airball is going to call as well, completing the action, and we go to a flop. King Jack 3, 2 clubs and a diamond here, and it checks over to us. And when we talk about c-betting multi-way, we talk about either having value, a draw to the nuts, or blocking the nuts. And in this specific scenario, I don't really have one of those.
I was looking forward to
things.
hearing the fourth category, which ace-4 of diamonds falls into here. Explain yourself.
Both of these players are going to be completing relatively wide because it is a stream game.
Particularly Nick, I think. He's squeezing relatively aggressively and then defending close to any two.
Yeah, he wants the VPIP high. So he's going to be completing, I'd say, north of 60% of hands here. And so I just think that this is almost kind of like a heads-up spot. I think when I bet here, Suited's going to be next to act and is going to have to worry about Airball behind him. He also has to worry, I'm opening essentially from under the gun here with 4 blinds or 5 blinds or however many blinds we have. So this is a board that's going to be very good for me, a double Broadway king high board. So Suited's going to have to continue very, very tight next to act. And then we get over to Airball. Well, Airball's completing with almost any 2 from the 5th blind here or whatever it is. So I think I'm just against one range that's going to have to continue extremely tight on the flop, and one range, which is Airball, that is just so wide that I think just c-betting range is good. So that's kind of why I decided to c-bet this hand, which doesn't look like a slam dunk c-bet on the surface, but does kind of have some good properties.
We do have a backdoor flush draw, we do have a backdoor straight draw, and we have an overcard. That is sometimes enough because we do have a little bit of an escape hatch if we're called.
And I think just multi-way, kind of my default is starting off with a small size, especially when I'm playing against competent players. And in this hand, we're playing against competent players, so I'm just going to start off with a small kind of size here. And I go with 1,200 into 3,300. Suited gets out of the way very quickly, and Airball snap calls.
Nick is one of those players where I'm not absolutely confident. I would be leaning into every single one of his timing tells as being hugely indicative of the types of hands he plays. I think one of Nick's real qualities is he plays fast. So I'm not sure I'd be thinking, oh, he snap called, he must have only middle of range.
The stronger the player, the less you can kind of read into timing tells. I wouldn't be necessarily leaning too hard on those kind of live reads. So he calls, we go to the turn. The turn now is an 8 of clubs, bringing in front door clubs, and Airball now checks it over to me, a Marc Goone.
So what is a Marc Goone thinking about when the front door completes? Not much of an escape hatch with ace-4 of diamonds anymore.
I'm thinking here, okay, first let's classify our hand. We have air. Maybe sometimes we could be beating a hand like queen 10, but other than that, we have nothing here. So when I have air, I'm kind of leaning into, okay, let's keep telling this story. We have a couple things going for us here to tell our story credibly, in that 1, we open under the gun. 2, we c-bet into multiple people on the flop. 3, this is a flop that is going to be perceived as good for our range. And 4, the front door draw gets there, which completes a lot of our semi-bluffs on the flop. So now I think this is a pretty good spot to keep barreling, even though we don't have equity. As far as sizing, I want to choose a size now that kind of forces him to raise off his flushes at a higher frequency, but also forces him to continue with one pair hands like King X, because I do think he's just going to have every King X suited completing here. So getting to the river, his range is going to look like a lot of one pair hands that we can just blast off on the river.
You want to funnel a range to the river that we have a chance of getting to fold, because the most profitable bluffs are going to be when they call flop, call turn, and fold river. So the more hands that we can get them to the river with, that stand a chance of folding when we put in a big bet on the river, the more likely our bluff is to be profitable here.
And one of the things we kind of try to teach is always ask before you come to the action, what happens if? So what happens here if I bet big? Well, if I bet big, he doesn't have as much incentive to raise his really strong hands like flushes. A lot of his flushes just call if we bet big here. And a lot of his king X without a club just folds here, which is not how we kind of want to construct his range getting to the river. Whereas if we bet small, king X calls, flushes raise, which is really nice for us getting to the river.
Yeah, and then from a more theoretical perspective, when a flush does come in on the turn, using a small size allows us to bet more than just flushes, right? It allows us to bet two pair. It might even allow us to bet a hand like ace king with the ace of clubs. When we bet large, we're really telling a story that my range is very, very strong or has a bluff in it.
Because we would want to bet a hand like pocket jacks or king jack suited or maybe even ace king like you said here. And if we choose a large size, well, we're just going to get value owned when we get called.
Right.
So I decide here to bet. I bet 2,000 here into 5,700, and we see he snap calls once again. Well, I don't think we can take too much away from the flop, and we don't want to get too into it against an experienced, solid player. I do think the snap call on the turn, once the nuts change, kind of allows us to maybe eliminate some flushes from his range, because I think the flushes here on the turn, maybe think about it for at least 3 seconds, possibly raising.
Yeah, I mean, I know I would think about raising a flush on it, particularly versus this small size, which again can be a wider range. And if I have a flush here, I would like to play a bigger pot than $10,000.
He also says something interesting here. Yeah. He says,
I know I'm going to call, so it's going to be quick.
Which I think I can kind of take some of the same thing away from that as the snap call.
I think he has a decent hand, but not necessarily a hand that he feels is thick value or could play for stacks. And therefore, we have a chance of folding those types of hands with an appropriate river size.
We go to a river, which is a queen, and he very quickly checks over to us again. And I kind of like this river. And the reason why I like this river is because one of the only bluffs that he's going to put me on is a hand like queen 10 suited. And now when the queen pairs on the river, I think you don't really see a lot of players turn queen X into a bluff, just kind of figuring they have some showdown value. Although I would argue queen X doesn't have showdown value.
Have a ton, but these triple Broadway boards are notoriously under bluffed because you have to start bluffing with some really uncomfortable hands. Some hands like ace 4 of diamonds or small pocket pairs, often with a club. A lot of people aren't capable of doing that, so therefore very naturally these boards become under bluffed.
So over to me on the river, and my thoughts on this river are, okay, we had the plan on the turn. We funneled his range to the river as a lot of king X, or maybe some hands like queen 10 with a club. I do think we could have ruled out some of those flushes on the turn, but there is a chance occasionally we could still run into a nut flush here, a hand that's kind of like he feels as the super nuts is invulnerable. So I do think he can have some strong hands here on this river that he's just not folding. So when we can run into a brick wall, we don't want to go balls to the wall crazy with our bluff size, because like when we do get snapped, that's horrible. And like all I'm trying to do in this situation is fold out hands like king 7 suited, like king 4 suited. And I just wanted to choose a size that's going to get those hands to fold 100% of the time.
Did your image play any part into this?
Yeah, of course.
How you perceive Nick to view you? Again, this game was probably advertised at $25, $50, $100. It's now playing with a $400 straddle. Did you think that maybe he would perceive you to be under bluffing in this spot, so therefore more likely to make big folds?
Yeah, I think he's certainly going to perceive me to be under bluffing, because I think he knows, A, that's a big game for me. The game's playing at least 4 times, if not 8 times as big. So I think he's just going to perceive me to be under bluffing for those reasons, on top of the fact that I opened under the gun, that I c-bet into multiple people, that it's a hard board to be bluffing. So I just thought it was a really, really, really good spot to pull the trigger because of all of those things kind of stacked on top of each other. So I go 13,000 and let's watch as Nick Airball comes to a decision.
Airball with 2 pair, but he can't beat the flush, can't beat a straight.
I have a pretty good hand. I'm like really close. Okay.
You pay me $1 million, I won't do that. I'm scared of.
Let's it go.
I got blue, no way, man.
I had the best hand.